Okay, here I am with my finished front, this side and this side. I put both fronts on a double pointed needle, on a long circular needle. Here are my decreases right at the edge. I have 15 stitches in each of my shoulders, which is what it says on my pattern. I went ahead, and I didn't show you this before, but I wrote down that I had bound off 2 stitches at the beginning of each of those sides. I didn't write it on both sides because this is a mirror image of that one, so I only have to put this information on one side. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I am a minimalist when it comes to putting information on my pattern. I don't want any excess information on there, and I don't need very much information. Just these numbers tell me what I need to know. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and knit these 2 shoulders together, or something close to that. Here's my back that I originally had. You saw that a long time ago. And I left a long tail, and this is the tail that I'm going to use. I could have left long tails on the front, but I didn't. I just like to do one long bind off, or the activity, because it just seems more coherent to me than dealing with this little thread and that little thread. That's also why I put it on a double pointed needle or a circular needle, so that I could work from either end with the front or back. Now notice I am putting right sides or public sides together. And by the way, I made sure that I had the same number of rows in this front, all the way from the rib, all the way from the bottom, as I do in the back. Notice I only had about 4 rows at the top that I worked straight. If you find that you don't have enough rows to work your decreases and get some straight rows in, you can always add a little bit more to this bind off here. That doesn't hurt a thing. Okay, now I have noticed on Ravelry recently that people are commenting, because I did a video on grafting. People are commenting about how they love to graft their shoulder seams together and how beautiful it looks. And I strongly recommend against it. I certainly recommend against it for adult sweaters, but I do even for children's sweaters. And that's because this is a structural piece. This shoulder seam holds up the sleeves, and it holds together the front and the back. It holds together the front exactly at the right width. So if you graft these together so that they can stretch out, you can end up with droopy, bowy shoulder seams and a neck. Now, usually for a child sweater, well, let's start with an adult sweater, because with an adult sweater, I always bind off the shoulder seam and bind off the neck edge, because again, this supports the shoulders and the sleeves, right? So you don't want this to be bowing because of the weight. And then I bind off the other, whoops, oh my goodness, it appears I've dropped a number of stitches. Let's just stop. Oh, this is good. Let's just stop and pick those little puppies up. These, this circular needle might be a little bit smaller than the one I worked it with, because I'm just using these as stitch holders. I don't care what size the needles were, because I'm not going to work with those needles. Now, with a child size sweater, if I have a regular crew neck, I do not bind off the back of the neck stitches. And that's because I want it ultra stretchy, because little kids have proportionately larger heads than adults. However, because this particular sweater has this nice big placket in it, this is going to stretch. If that doesn't stretch over that baby's head, then we just have to call the Einstein Center. So in this case, I'm going to bind off the shoulder sleeve, or the shoulder seams. Gosh, I keep dropping these stitches. And the back of the neck, all in one swell swoop, which I'm going to say that again, one fell swoop, all in one graceful line. Now to do that, you put the right sides together. Here's my front, here's my back, and I'm going to start by knitting these together. Now, by the way, this is not my preferred method, but I'm going to show it to you anyway, because the 3, and notice I had a nice little butterfly here, so this has just been hanging out waiting for me. This is the preferred way to do it. Insert into the first stitch on the front needle, insert into the first stitch on the back needle, knit them together, and drop them off both needles. Again, insert as if to knit into the front needle. On the very next stitch, insert as if to knit on the back needle. Oops. Knit them together, drop them both off, and now you have two on the needle. And notice I've made them nice and loose because, again, this is a bind off, and you pass it over. And there's your first bound off stitch. Oops, got that caught. Let's try it again. Into the front stitch, into the back stitch, knit the two of them together, drop off, and pass over. Again, this is the Goldilocks principle. This should not be too tight. This should not be too loose. This bind off should be just as wide as those stitches are at rest. I'll do one more before I switch over to my much preferred method. You can see why this is called 3 needle bind off. Get that nice and long. It's because I'm using 3 needles here. Okay, but for me, because I've been a crocheter forever, and even if you weren't a crocheter forever, this just strikes me as easier. I stick a crochet hook in there and insert into the front, into the back, pull one loop through both of them, drop it off, pull it through. Let's try that again. Insert in the front, insert into the back, pull a loop through both of those stitches. So this is not the three needle bind off. This is 2 needles and a hook bind off, which is just my favorite. Notice I'm pulling nice big loops. Well, not too huge. We don't want them to be gargantuan. As you approach these last couple of stitches, I'll pick that up the way it's supposed to be. Remember that you can choose to knit. I have a very loose stitch there. That's all. It's just because it's an end. Okay, so I have bound off the first shoulder. And if I were having a closed or a small regular crew neck, I would simply knit all the way across until I got to the last 15 stitches in my case, and I would knit those 2 shoulders together. In this case, I'm just going to bind these off, and I think I'm going to switch back to the knitting needle just because that's a little bit more common orientation for you. So that now I'm in the back of the neck, and I'm going to bind off all of those. Now I'm going to switch back to my crochet hook, and I'm going to knit these 2 together. Well, I'll get to that crochet hook in a second, won't I? Oops, pass over. This is why I prefer the crochet hook, because it's a little bit cumbersome to have these 2 left-handed needles. And pass over with that front one, or come in with our handy dandy hook and go all the way across until this is bound off. So here we are. Here's the front. Here's our bound off placket. We worked even until we got to, in my case, 2.5 inches. Well, in everybody's case, it should be 2.5 inches below where the back ended. And I finished the rest of this shaping. This is identical shaping, doing every other row, a little bit of bind off, and then every other row decreases. Then I worked straight up to there, and look at that. That looks a lot like my picture. So go ahead and complete your bind off all the way across, bind off these stitches across the back of the neck, do a 3 needle bind off or a 2 needle and hook bind off here, bind off the stitches across the back of the neck, then bind off those, and then when you come back, you are going to learn the magical more or less formula, which is the key to your knitting freedom. Well, one of the keys anyway. See you then.